The smell hits before anything else. Grain fermenting in oak barrels, wet straw on a stone floor, smoke from a fire that never fully goes out. A woman moves through a low-ceilinged room, her hands calloused and dark at the knuckles, filling clay cups from a vessel she carries against her hip. The men at the table do not look up. They drink slowly, methodically, the way one drinks when the goal is not pleasure but reduction, the reduction of something internal that has no name in the language of the time. Outside, the village is already working. It has been working since before the light came. The fields around it stretch in long, narrow strips, each one assigned by a lord who lives behind stone walls several miles east. The peasants who work those strips do not own them. They work them in exchange for the right to exist on the land. That is the transaction. That is the entire structure of their lives. The cup is not a luxury. It is a tool. Medieval Europe between the 11th and 14th centuries was not a romantic landscape of chivalry and cathedral light. It was a system of organized extraction. Feudal lords held land. Peasants worked it. The church administered meaning. Each layer took something from the layer below it, and the layer at the bottom, the one that did the actual physical labor, absorbed what remained after all the extractions were complete. What remained was rarely enough, and it was never stable. A peasant family in northern France around 1200 would wake before dawn, work until dark, eat a meal that consisted primarily of bread, pottage, and whatever vegetables survived the season. Meat was a seasonal and often accidental luxury. Milk was for children when available. Water from rivers and wells was perpetually suspect. Not in the modern epidemiological sense, because germ theory did not exist, but in the practical sense that people who drank certain water became ill and people who drank fermented grain did not. That observation, accumulated over generations, produced a behavioral norm. Fermented drinks were safe. Water was not. This was not superstition. It was empirical knowledge without the theoretical framework to explain it. Ale was brewed at home by women, alewives, using barley, water, and whatever bittering agents were locally available. Before hops became standard, brewers used combinations of bog myrtle, yarrow, wormwood, and other plants collectively called gruit. Some of those plants had mild psychoactive properties. None of that was incidental. The choice of additives was not random. It was the product of centuries of experimentation with what the local environment offered and what the human body responded to. The church understood this. Monasteries were, by the 12th century, among the largest producers of fermented beverages in Europe. Benedictine and Cistercian houses maintained brewing operations of considerable scale. The monks who worked those breweries were not acting in contradiction to their vows. Within the institutional logic of the time, fermented drink was medicine, sustenance, and, when used in moderation, an acceptable comfort for bodies that labored constantly and suffered regularly. The Church's position on intoxication was complicated by the fact that its own infrastructure depended on the trade. The system was not opposed to altered states. It was built on them. What made the medieval use of herbs and alcohol structurally significant was not the substances themselves, but the conditions that made them necessary. The peasant who drank ale every morning before going into the field was not making a cultural choice in any meaningful sense of that phrase. He was operating within a biological and psychological economy shaped entirely by the demands placed on his body and mind. The feudal system extracted labor on a schedule that did not pause for grief, illness, failed harvests, or the death of children. The calendar moved because the Lord's calendar moved. Rent was due when it was due. The grain had to be in before the frost. There was no mechanism for rest. There was no concept of mental recovery as a legitimate need. What existed was endurance, the capacity to keep working regardless of what the body or mind was holding. And the substances that made that endurance possible were embedded into the daily routine with the same functional logic as tools and clothing. They were not escaping life. They were making life operational. The invisible architecture beneath this behavior became most visible during periods of acute pressure. The Black Death, which entered Europe through Sicilian ports in 1347, was not the first catastrophe medieval populations had faced, but it was the most total. Within 2 years of its arrival, it had moved through trading routes, river valleys, and mountain passes with a consistency that defied every explanation available at the time. The church said it was divine punishment. Physicians said it was caused by bad air. Municipal authorities responded with quarantine measures that were sometimes effective and often abandoned when the economic cost became too great. None of those explanations were adequate. None of the responses stopped it. The Black Death killed between a third and a half of Europe's population between 1347 and 1353. In some cities, the mortality rate was higher. Florence lost between 60 and 70% of its population in the outbreak of 1348. Entire villages in rural England and France simply ceased to function, not because everyone died, but because the threshold of working adults required to maintain the agricultural cycle fell below the minimum needed for survival, and the survivors left. The scale of that loss had no psychological precedent. What happened in the taverns, the monasteries, and the private dwellings of Europe during and after the plague years was not a sudden change in behavior. It was an intensification of something that already existed. The ale that had always been drunk in the morning was now drunk in greater quantities. The herbal preparations that had always been used to manage pain and induce sleep were now used to manage something that had no medical category. The sustained awareness of mass death, the disappearance of familiar faces on a weekly basis, the collapse of the social structures that had given daily life its predictability. The tools of numbing became tools of survival. Among the most significant and least discussed mechanisms of this period was the spread of ergot contamination through grain supplies. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and other cereals under specific climatic conditions, wet summers following cold winters. When ergot-contaminated grain was milled and baked into bread without detection, the people who ate it absorbed ergotamine, a compound with vasoconstrictive and psychoactive properties. The effects ranged from burning sensations in the extremities to hallucinations, convulsions, and sustained altered states lasting days. The outbreaks of dancing mania documented across Germany, the Low Countries, and France in the 14th and 15th centuries, events in which groups of people danced uncontrollably in the streets for hours or days, reportedly unable to stop, have been analyzed as mass hysteria, religious ecstasy, and coordinated performance. The ergot hypothesis, first proposed systematically in the 20th century, offers a different explanation. Communities consuming contaminated grain from a shared supply would have experienced synchronized psychoactive effects. The dancing was not metaphorical. This was not chosen. It was structural. The authorities who observed these events, ecclesiastical and secular alike, responded in ways that reveal the institutional priorities of the time. Local clergy sometimes attempted to treat dancing episodes as demonic possession, performing exorcisms that had no effect on the physiological cause. Civil authorities in some cities attempted to force the dancers to continue until they collapsed, on the theory that exhaustion would end the episode. Neither intervention addressed the actual mechanism, because neither institution had the conceptual framework to identify it. The gap between what was happening and what people understood to be happening was total. What made the 14th century particularly distinct was the convergence of multiple pressure systems. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 had already reduced peasant populations across northern Europe before the plague arrived. Decades of crop failure, livestock disease, and inflated grain prices had created a demographic and psychological landscape of chronic insufficiency. The plague did not arrive into a stable society. It arrived into a society that had already been operating under sustained stress for a generation. The herbal knowledge that circulated through village healers, monastic herbalists, and market apothecaries was extensive and pragmatic. Mandrake root, belladonna, henbane, and hemlock were all documented in medieval herbals as substances capable of inducing sleep, dulling pain, and producing visions. The women who administered these preparations, often referred to as wise women or in later centuries, accused as witches, understood the dosage relationships between these plants and the human body in ways that took generations of accumulated observation to develop. That knowledge was not marginal. It was central to how communities managed suffering. The Church's relationship to this body of knowledge was consistently contradictory. On the institutional level, canon law condemned the use of preparations for purposes that interfered with the rational soul, a broad category that could include anything from contraception to the deliberate induction of altered states for non-medical purposes. On the practical level, the same monasteries that produced theological condemnations of intoxication maintained medicinal gardens containing every plant listed above. The Benedictine rule explicitly allowed the sick to receive whatever food and drink would help their recovery. The definition of what constituted sickness was flexible when applied to monks and rigid when applied to peasants. The system protected its own access, while restricting access for others. By the middle of the 14th century, the tavern had become a social institution with functions that extended well beyond the sale of fermented drink. It was the place where labor was negotiated, where news traveled, where the recently widowed found temporary community, and where the psychological weight of the season was distributed across a group rather than carried by an individual. The ale itself was secondary to the function. What the tavern provided was regulated escape from isolation, a space where the ordinary rules of deference and silence that structured peasant interaction with authority were temporarily suspended. That suspension was allowed because it served the system. A population that had a release valve was less likely to direct its energy elsewhere. The point of no return came not as a single event, but as an administrative reality. When the Black Death's second wave arrived in the 1360s, smaller than the first but still lethal, the institutional structures that had defined medieval life for 2 centuries began losing their coherence. The church had failed visibly. Priests had died in large numbers. In some regions, there were not enough ordained clergy to administer last rites to the dying, which, within the theological framework of the time, meant that entire communities were dying outside of grace. That failure was not forgotten. The flagellant movements that spread across Germany, the Low Countries, and northern Italy between 1348 and 1350 were not primarily about penance. They were a collective attempt to produce, through physical trauma, the kind of psychological state that altered the relationship between the individual and unbearable reality. Groups of men and women moved from town to town, publicly scourging themselves in choreographed sequences, singing hymns that were also laments. Contemporary accounts describe participants entering states of dissociation, the same functional outcome that alcohol and psychoactive herbs produce through biochemical means. The method differed. The destination was the same. The desire to leave ordinary consciousness was not deviant. It was the dominant psychological response to conditions that ordinary consciousness could not process. What remained after the 14th century settled into its final decades was a Europe materially and institutionally altered. The labor shortage created by plague mortality gave surviving peasants a structural leverage they had not previously possessed. Wages rose in some regions. Serfdom became harder to enforce in others. The church's authority over daily life began its long, slow erosion that would eventually produce the Reformation. None of that was planned. None of it was the result of an ideology or a movement. It was the mechanical output of a system that had absorbed more pressure than its architecture was designed to hold. The herbs and the alcohol were not causes. They were symptoms, visible daily, physical evidence of a population managing an existence that provided no legitimate channel for the acknowledgement of pain. The man drinking before dawn was not weak. He was operating within the only psychological technology available to him in a world that had not yet developed any other. The woman preparing a belladonna tincture for a neighbor who could not sleep after losing 3 children in a single month was not practicing witchcraft. She was practicing medicine with the instruments her tradition had accumulated. The gap between what those actions were and what the institutional record called them is itself a document. It records not what people did, but what the structures around them were willing to see. What the structures were willing to see was rarely what was actually there. The altered states of medieval Europe were not a failure of moral character or spiritual discipline. They were a rational, if chemically mediated, response to a world in which suffering was chronic, institutionally unacknowledged, and structurally reinforced. The people who sought those states were not fleeing reality in any philosophical sense. They were managing a reality that the available language, theology, and medicine were collectively insufficient to address. The barley fermenting in the morning dark, the dried herbs in the healer's pouch, the tavern fire burning through February, these were not signs of collapse. They were signs of a population finding, in the available materials of its world, the minimum conditions required to keep moving forward through something that had no name and no end in sight.